Have you ever fought like 40 goblins and kobolds in a series of slightly interesting but largely unchanging encounters? Have you ever gotten through a dungeon and changed your class at the end, only to realize that the edition you're playing is actually pretty fun? I'm Dungeon Dandy, survivor of the 4th edition D&D module, The Keep on the Shadowfell. There's something I'd like for you to think about going into this episode. What would you do if you had to fight 40 more goblins? Would you cut and run? Or would you stay and fight, knowing that the loot at the end of the dungeon was only a faint glimmer of light in a tunnel of unending darkness? My first foray into 4th edition has a humble and horrible beginning. Like all D&D parties, ours had a tragic backstory. Our adventuring party was not your average one. We were losers. We were failures. Our first job was to clear out a tavern cellar of rats, and in that fight we lost somebody deep to us. His name starts with an R, I think. What we had seen down in that tavern cellar was unspeakable. Our dear party member, Richard Roberto, we couldn't even find his body. We don't really even know what we saw, but whatever we saw down there, we had to flee town, fleeing from that basement, fleeing from the thing that we had seen down there, and everybody laughed at us. They didn't believe us. They didn't believe that we could lose somebody to rats, and it brings a tear to your eye just thinking about it. He was so young, and he was like a friend to us all. Needless to say, our group lived in a constant state of fear, loss, and mourning. We were kicked out, going from town to town. We had no home. We wanted to prove something of ourselves, prove that we could be real adventurers. So when we were on our way to the town of Winterhaven and were attacked by kobolds out there, our first reaction was that the rats were back. Basil, our gnome wizard, started screaming and cowering in fear as he saw the shifty creatures moving from rock to rock. Our adventuring party had consisted of a motley crew of characters. There was me, playing Heartland Morg, the coach of the team, the hobgoblin warlord whose deep insecurity and fear was masked by a veneer of bashfulness and superiority. There was Basil, the gnome wizard, who would constantly shriek, cower, and flee from enemies. There was Dexel, the human fighter male, riding the dark, demonic horse Bartleby. There was Ulrin, the catboy ranger of a race I don't actually know, who dealt so much damage he made everybody else feel inferior. I mean, there was no hope of competing with him. There was Balthazar, the Goliath sorcerer. When his player first introduced him, he accidentally said, "I extend my meat," instead of saying, "I extend my meaty hand," so Balthazar, needless to say, was not very helpful to the team. There was one encounter in particular where Balthazar didn't use his daily powers, and Heartland made sure to yell at him for that. Any mention of rats would bring most of our party to tears, Basil and Dexel especially. We lived in constant fear of Dexel's horse, Bartleby. In the first combat encounter of the module, Bartleby had chased after some kobolds while Dexel had been dismounted. I remember Dexel dropping to his knees, hands in the air, screaming at the sky, "It's too late. I can't stop him now." What we saw that horse do, we contemplated getting rid of it, of course, but we were afraid that it was going to hear us. We were afraid that if we sold it off to somebody, that if we had bought a new horse, that it was going to track us down. Eventually, though, we made it into the town of Winterhaven, and eager to prove ourselves, we undercut another adventuring party to take up a job at half the price. We needed the money. There was a moment in Winterhaven's tavern where Basil was sat down at a table with an elderly man in town. The man told him, "Son, it looks like you've seen a ghost." Basil turned to the old man and said, "Do you know what I've seen? What these hands have done?" Heartland quickly ran over, grabbed Basil by the head, and began shaking him and yelling at him, "Shut up, please, you're ruining this for us. Keep it together, please. We need this job." Things weren't going so well for our party. One more kobold encounter later, we had finally made it to the kobold lair, where we fought more kobolds that were led by the vicious mercenary Irontooth, another hobgoblin that Heartland remembered from his youth days. Our party narrowly defeated Irontooth, with most people being knocked unconscious during that fight. When we searched Irontooth's corpse, we found a letter by Calorel the Vile detailing a plan to sacrifice the entire town of Winterhaven to his demonic lord Orcus. The party of heroes rushed back to Winterhaven to find the town in a state of living undeath. People were depressed. They felt like they had their graves trampled upon, like they were in one world and out the other. The rival adventuring party that we had undercut had turned against the town, willing to work for Calorel the Vile and serve him. Though when the party showed us an illusion of Calorel that began to speak, the party took one good look at Calorel for what he was. A loser, in a really stupid helmet and cape and with a really dumb looking staff. It was hard to take Calorel seriously. We insulted him, he insulted us. Typical stuff. He essentially said, "I'm really evil. Come to my really cool castle to keep on the Shadowfell and see if you want to stop me. Otherwise, I'm going to sacrifice their entire town." So, we trekked to the keep on the Shadowfell. The first encounter in the keep involved a fight with some rats and some goblins, and the rats clearly brought up some bad memories for everybody in the party. However, we defeated them. It was that session, however, that my enjoyment as a player heavily began to wane as I realized that we had just been fighting small creatures on and off for the past month. Things were not really that fun. Later expeditions into the keep showed combat encounters that I would rather not replay. The fun roleplay that our party had cultivated began to fall apart by the time we were in the keep, given that we were all getting very tired of fighting the same small creatures over and over again. I find it kind of ironic that for a module titled The Keep on the Shadowfell, I started having the least fun by the time we actually got to the keep. There is a reason for my own lack of enjoyment that comes from the fact that it turns out I had probably the worst warlord powers that you could pick, and I felt totally useless in each combat. While I did hear good things about the warlord, I was severely annoyed by my own ability set, and at the end of the dungeon I did end up switching to cleric, and I started having more fun in the combat encounters. By that point though, I felt like it was too late. There was one fight in particular where we fought about a dozen goblins, or at least what felt like a dozen goblins, in a combat encounter that took way too long. Now, if you're playing other editions like 5th edition, a goblin might go down in about 2 hits. In 4th edition, a goblin goes down in about 4. Things just feel like they take twice as long, and for an edition of D&D that is so tactical, I found that interesting combat mechanics were rarely used when it came to the actual monsters themselves. During this particular horrendous goblin encounter, I snapped. I started yelling, "The goblins aren't real. None of this is real. It's just a game. They're just numbers on a screen. They don't mean anything. We're not role-playing anything here." That was supposed to be the last goblin encounter, but still, things had kind of wore on me by then. From that point on, we rushed to complete the dungeon, and we did. Things were more fun once we actually got to the second part of the keep. By that time, my GM had already decided that he wanted to run a Dark Sun campaign, and this foray into 4th edition didn't really seem like it landed all that well with everybody. The fight with Calorel the Vile at the end was bittersweet. By that time, we had learned to synergize our abilities with one another as players, so combat did get more interesting, especially in that final fight. At the same time, though, the fight itself felt like a slog at times, with a lot of skeletons being thrown at the party for reasons that just seemed like padding. This is a thing I noticed in the adventure. Oftentimes, they just kind of throw one type of enemy at you, or a cool enemy, or a more powerful one, and then just a lot of minions of one type, and it doesn't really make for that interesting fights. There was a moment in the final fight with Calorel that really did stand out to me, though. Matt Colville, Matt Colville, Matt Colville, Matt Colville. Yes, that's right, a spirit of Matthew Colville appeared in the game after we failed to finish off Calorel the Vile with a super cool combat move that we had set up. Things were really funny. The token disappeared after a little bit. The general sentiment with our group was going, how could Matthew Colville do this? How could he run the Keep on the Shadowfell? How did he make it work? There were times when we were playing this game where I threw my hands up in the air and I went, did they even play test this? At times it really didn't feel like they did, because the monster encounters weren't that interesting on the whole. And there was also a lot of just padding in the module that I don't really see a group having that much fun with. Out of all the sessions we played in the Keep on the Shadowfell, there was one combat encounter that did stand out to me as really fun. It wasn't the fight with Colville the Vile at the end, but rather one with a bunch of hobgoblin soldiers and a big spider that would jump around in a pit in the middle that you could be pushed into. I think 4th edition works really well when you have environmental hazards as well as different monster types in an area. Unfortunately, though, that hardly happens, at least in my experience with the game. There are a lot of encounters that just feel repetitive. The kobold ambush on the way to Irontooth's lair, for example, feels largely unnecessary, especially because the previous encounter in the module is one that's very similar with kobolds. There's one time where the module tells you to go outside of the keep and go to this one burial site, but my group didn't end up doing that. My GM didn't really feel like it was that connected to the game. Maybe that encounter is cool, but I'm kind of mixed. I'll say that this game suffers from general genericness, and not generic in the way that a 2nd edition module might be about going into caves and killing monsters and such. This module feels less old school like that and more just plain and kind of lame. I can see why a lot of people turned away from 4th edition, especially if their first experience with it was this module. I don't really blame them. I think there's a lot of fun that can be had with 4th edition once you figure out how the game works a bit more and if your GM puts in some really interesting combat encounters, but otherwise this module really suffers. After that one goblin encounter that broke me as a player, I went online and I tried to find a used copy of the module that I could flip through once we were done playing. And this did arrive in pretty good condition. I did flip through this and I do like some things here, so let me tell you about that. First of all, the booklet itself for the game is fairly easy to read. The one thing I will say it suffers from is a lack of art for the monsters, especially because I think you can just run this adventure with this booklet and with the character sheets they provide, so I don't think you need any monster manuals or dungeon master's guides or whatever. So the fact that there isn't art, let's say, for the kobold dragon shields or things of that nature kind of annoys me because I just wish that there was. Oftentimes there's art in here, but it's for the dungeon map itself, and I think that this speaks to the priorities of this module and what I can extrapolate to 4th edition as a whole. This module is concerned more with dungeon layouts and where the monsters are positioned when you go into every combat encounter. They're keyed on specific parts of the map. And while that can be cool, I just feel like it puts so much of an emphasis on where the monsters are, but not really what they are or what their motivations are. This is a problem I ran into during the game where it didn't really feel like the monsters we were fighting were really anything but kind of hit points and numbers. That all said though, I think for an 80-page booklet, it's pretty fine. I just wouldn't run the adventure as written. I'd probably tweak with some encounters as well as the story, but I think there's some stuff you could definitely use here. The map of the dungeon itself, I think, is serviceable and fine. Just in the course of actual play, it almost doesn't make sense for some encounters to be happening. It just feels like so much time is taken up in certain parts of the keep that don't really advance the plot forward. So if I was running this, I would definitely tweak that, and I'd probably come up with a plot of your own, and maybe if you're gonna use Calro, adapt him and try and make him less, honestly, cartoonish and very, not cartoonish in like a fun way. He's cartoonish in more of a I can't take him seriously as a villain way. Okay, moving on. The quick start guide for this game is pretty good. It has all the rules you need for combat, for actions, for doing things. I will say the actual characters themselves just are generic, but again, this is a starter thing, so I don't know what you're really going to expect beyond Dwarf Fighter, Human Wizard, etc. But let's take this page for the Dwarf Fighter right here. It gives you all the guides for advancing to different levels, the powers that you have as a character. I think it's fairly easy to read. This goes for the other characters too, so that's pretty good. That said, what I will dig at here is that the descriptions for the characters, the sample ones, are about as bland as the ones for the monsters in the adventure. And by that I mean this. As a dwarf, you share many qualities with the earth and rock of your mountain home. You are strong, hardy, and dependable. As a fighter, your job is to defend your allies. You are brave, loyal, and devoted to the cause of goodness. I kind of wish for pre-made characters there was a bit more motivation to be doing what you're doing, maybe a bit more personality thrown into these characters. The one for the halfling rogue is kind of annoying to me. As a halfling, you are resourceful and known for your quick wits and steady nerves. As a rogue, your job is to dart in and deal massive damage and use your skills to aid your allies as necessary. So we see a similar thing that happens with the monsters in the module, where it's more split up on their tactics themselves. While I do appreciate that the game here tells you how to play a rogue in combat, I do find it kind of annoying that you get so little as to what a halfling rogue might be in this world beyond just their job, and I think the one-sentence description for halfling is just not really helpful for a player that much. I wish there was a bit more background thrown into these characters. Yeah, just some more personality. Okay, so there's one thing in this module that I do really like, and that's the fact that it comes with fold-out battle maps for play to put down at your table for key moments of the adventure, for outdoor terrain, for boss battles, for Caloril the Vile, etc. They come out with 3 maps right here, and they're double-sided. They're quite large when you fold them out. I think that's cool. The only thing I felt like was missing were maps for the actual keep on the Shadowfell itself. There are rooms that are keyed out, like the big boss rooms, but I wish for a game that placed so much emphasis on dungeon tactics that there was a map of the dungeon itself. That might have been really big. I don't know how possible that would be, but I kind of wish it was there. When this first came out, it retailed for $30. Obviously, you can find it for cheaper used now, and I would recommend doing so if you're interested in looking at this. Of course, I'm sure you could find a PDF online. I think there are some lessons that can be learned from this style of module, and by that I mean coming with ready-made character sheets, coming with this nice kind of folder to keep all of your stuff in, as well as the fact that there are battle maps. Right now, you're paying about $50 for a new D&D adventure if you don't find it for cheaper online somewhere. I do wish that these newer modules did come out with battle maps like the Keep on the Shadowfell did, just because there are times where I look at these books and I wish I had a map just to put down on the table for a location that might be hard to map out by hand, or just kind of annoying to put together with whatever tiles you might have lying around. Ultimately, I think this module is worth looking at if you're a GM, but I don't know if I'd recommend running this as written. I definitely heavily tweak with it, make it your own, throw in some extra villains, maybe mess with the monster manual and see if there's some cooler monsters you might be able to put in here. The whole 40 goblins thing became a joke in my group for the amount of times that we'd have a combat encounter that boiled down to a small creature comes up to you, stabs you for massive damage, shifts away 1 square to prevent an opportunity attack, and then kind of just laughs at you. Meanwhile, on your next turn, you just walk up 1 square to hit them anyway, so the whole thing feels kind of annoying and uneventful. If you're looking to run a 4th edition module for players by the book without doing much conversions, I wouldn't recommend this game. I'd go look for something else out there, whether something independent or official. I'm sure you can find something online. If you know any good 4th edition modules, please tell me, because I'd like to start running some for people whenever I get the chance. I recently ordered the core set of 4th edition rules because my preamble at the beginning of this video was true. When I did change classes, I realized that there is a lot of fun to be had here, especially when players work with one another to sort of stack up their combat abilities, and makes for some really cool combos. The ability to combo in 4th edition, to mix and match your combat powers with the other players, is something that I haven't seen in other games, and I think it's really cool. It's quite fun. 4th edition does make basic combat fun. Even your regular at-will powers have some cool effect to them. They either help one of your teammates or further harm your enemies. There's always this added effect that makes you feel like you're doing something tactically useful. Unless you're taking the horrible powers I did, of course. If you're Matthew Colville watching this video, please tell me how you did it. Anyway, if you're running this game, please add some flavor to it, add some cool stuff, and I think maybe you could salvage this. When I ordered this copy and it finally got here, I just sort of stared at it and I said, I can fix you. I believe that's possible, to some extent. I don't know if I have the energy to do it right now, but I think that there's something that can be done to make this game just a little bit better, or at least take the assets that are in here and port them over into something else. I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from 4th edition design, so I do encourage people to check it out. There are some fun things here. My end message is this: don't criticize 4th edition if you're not willing to at least give it a shot, because there are things to learn from here. I didn't really have fun with this module, but there were times where I could see the glimmer of light at the end of the unending tunnel of darkness. If you don't want to run the Keep on the Shadowfell or 4th edition, I do recommend looking at the 4th edition monster manual. There are cool things like how monsters often have lots of variants, so a hobgoblin is not just a hobgoblin. There might be hobgoblins that do many sorts of different things. I think that's cool. It gives one enemy type a lot of variety. However, this module suffers from doing that a lot. While there is a lot of variety within one monster group like kobolds, I don't recommend having only kobold encounters just because you can. It really gets old after a while, and that's what happened in this module. Okay, that's the end of my video about the Keep on the Shadowfell. This took much longer to make than I thought. I went through several takes of this. My camera almost broke down. There's really a lot of drama surrounding this video. I hope you enjoyed the video and can learn something from 4th edition. This is Dungeon Dandy thanking you and signing off. Have a good one, everybody.